Okay, welcome to this Friday presentation at the BAPT 2021 conference. It's a pleasure today to welcome David Poole. He's going to talk about chapter 2 from Psychological Types, which is a very interesting chapter and one of the, as you can see from the slide, Jung recommends himself. So thanks, David, for coming, and take it away.
All right, that sounds great. Thanks, Richard. Welcome everybody. It's good to see y'all. Thanks for coming and joining my presentation. Sharing with Richard, I had a nightmare last night that I'd overslept and was halfway through the presentation here and struggling desperately to connect. So I'm glad to actually be here, be awake. Happy to be here at BAPT again. Have a lot of material to cover, so I'm going to go fairly quickly. But just want to mention, I am an MBTI certified master practitioner. I had a psychology undergraduate degree, and I'm currently enrolled in a graduate doctorate program in Jungian psychology. So have a real history with this material and a real interest. Do want to say I know that Zoom can be a bit much. There's going to be a good chunk of this presentation that's about photography and image. So my recommendation would be to shrink me down as small as possible and get these pictures as big as you can. And hopefully we'll have an enjoyable, beautiful, and maybe even something that will move you, your soul, your spirit, your connection to your inner world. These are the kind of themes I'm going to be looking at. But yeah, Jung did talk about emphasizing chapters 2 and 5, and so I chose to take a look at chapter 2 as a way for me to get more familiar, kind of more at a bigger kind of frame, what it was that Jung was getting at. So here are my goals for the presentation. I do want to try to maybe broaden type to include a bigger sense of Jung's model of the psyche. In particular, Jung talks about this as his structural functional model of the human psyche, which I thought was pretty fascinating, because what is type? Well, in some ways, it's this structural functional model. Hopefully entice some people to read Jung's works directly, either Psychological Type or some articles I'll show that he's interested in. And then to speak actually about some things that are important and that move me, and hopefully that'll maybe move you as well. And then finally, to explore Friedrich Schiller's aesthetic beauty and play instinct solutions to the type problem, and share some of my own photography, including, for example, this image. And one of my questions for you there is, how does this image make you feel? Not so much rationally analyzing it, but does it move something into you, inside you? I feel almost compelled to explain some things, to point out that this is Mount Hood, or that this was the day of the eclipse a few years ago. But some of Schiller's solution here is an experience of beauty can be a helpful way of balancing out some of our intuitive and some of our thinking preferences, and that those functions play an important role in the psyche. And that's part of what the problem is. But right up front in chapter 2, Jung says, and I'm going to read most of these quotes, they'll be on the screen. It's about half quotes and about half images. And for this reason, he suggests that he might be accused of putting a construction on Schiller's ideas that his actual words do not warrant. So he'll try to quote actual words at every point. I'm going to quote extensively during this presentation. Pretty much all of the photos are my photos. I'm in a few photos, I'll mention that. I'm not a professional photographer. I've won a few small contests in some local newspapers. But Jung was no artist, but he did some paintings as well, especially during his confrontation with the unconscious that got published in the Red Book. This is one of the images from that book. It's stunning in the big edition of the Red Book. But it's a way for, we're going to talk about rationality, and it's a way to kind of get oneself out of one's head. But as far as chapter 2, he writes in this 1935 introduction that far too many readers have succumbed to the error of thinking that chapter 10, which is where the type descriptions are, that represents the essential content and purpose. That the opinion has got about that my method of treatment consists in fitting patients into the system and giving them corresponding advice. Classification, he says, is nothing but a childish parlor game. And this is kind of hard in some ways for the type community. I think sometimes we do want to get people to best fit type and give them some insights about that. But at the same time, Jung talks a lot about one-sidedness, and I think he's going a little overboard here. Leave it to an INTP to spend 20 years studying the psyche and then to blame people for being overly simplistic for having to be introduced to it. So take a little bit with a grain of salt, this idea that we have to go and understand the conscious and unconscious psyche, and that introducing somebody to the very notion of type is also valuable. I love this image. And in part, I think I have it here because of the lighthouse, that we can use type at the top, kind of half of this image as a guiding light post for our conscious ego. But there's also this underside, this more fluid, ephemeral, unconscious aspect. And that, wholeness psychologically is to see ourselves in both sides of this. And I'll mention if people do find any of these images particularly appealing to pop it into chat if anything resonates with you. In 1960, shortly before he died, he wrote this letter to this guy named von Franz, who was looking for type research from him. And he clarified that his original tendency was not the classification of normal or pathological individuals, but rather the discovery of ways and means by which I could express in a comprehensible way the peculiarities, to use as a lot that word, of an individual psyche and the functional interplay of its elements. So Jung really gets at this notion of individuation and who the peculiar individual, me, Thor, Nina, Jerry, Alan, like what makes us not just an ESFJ or an INTP, but makes us a Susan or Claire or Roger. And some of that is in this model. And all of us, I think, know the functions: introverted feeling, extroverted thinking, some of these polarities, the introverted, extroverted parts of it. So hopefully we'll get a chance to look at some of that. So I don't know if this image moves you. I know that it moves me deeply. This is the green moss of the Pacific Northwest where I live. This is a river that's dear to me. It's a very good friend, 70-year-old, a wise old man in my life who's out there living his life. And also, this is a river that has burned this past year. Global climate change has caused even green, wet Oregon to go up in smoke. And Jung really places his psychological types in a historical context that I hope to emphasize here as well, that Jung had just come out of World War I that he was struggling with, but we have our own issues. Also from that letter to von Franz, he says that his book was written to demonstrate the structural and functional aspects of certain typical elements of the psyche, which I find fascinating, that such a means of communication explanation could also be used as a means of classification was an aspect that I was rather afraid of, since that intellectually detached classifying point of view is just the thing to be avoided by the therapist. Which makes some sense. And maybe we're not all psychoanalysts here and aren't necessarily trying to tease out the individual, but it's something to be aware of. The type is a great introduction to understanding the psyche and identifying, wow, like these are people like me, but it's also a means for going further. And I think many of us have been around type for a long time, have that opportunity to engage in this subtitle here, the Psychology of Individuation. This was a really important part for Jung, of becoming individual, of separating out from the typical pieces that we all share and becoming more individual. Chapter 2 is about this guy, Friedrich von Schiller. Psychological types is chronological. So he lived he's writing this book, these letters right after the French Revolution. Some of you might recognize Ode to Joy, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Schiller also wrote. And Jung identifies him as the first person to have identified the psychological functions and taken that approach to human beings. Going to give a quick rundown of psychological types, the chapters. If we have time at the end, I've got a more detailed version of this we might take a look at, but he looks at classical and medieval thought. He looks at Schiller's ideas, so 1795 or so, Apollonian and the Dionysian. He looks at Friedrich Nietzsche, actually, in chapter 3. Looks at human character. This one's, I think, the one that's about introverted feeling and extroverted feeling, interestingly. And then I just want to kind of note the theme here of the type problem in poetry, the problem in psychopathology, the type problem in aesthetics, the type problem in modern philosophy, and the type problem in biography. So while there's psychological types, there's a problem that he's trying to work on here. And there's chapter 10, where the general descriptions is. Chapter 11 is where all of Jung's definitions are. So just going in and reading through some of these definitions gives you a real sense of what he was all on about. And then I want to highlight these 4 papers that are at the back of the book. Those are far more accessible ways of getting at Jung by reading those short chapters that were written after 1921. 1913 was when he first started writing about it. So hopefully some of this is just beautiful, just a chance for people to resonate. Well, what does this feel? You know, for thinking intuitives, and this chapter is in large part about INTP versus ENFJ. How does INTP get out of their head and their thoughts? But it raises the question of what are the problems? You know, in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, he asks this question and says that he's going to restrict himself to problems. That is, things that are difficult, questionable, ambiguous, and with questions that allow for more than one answer and are always open to doubt. So there's a lot of room in here. And I just want to not feel like we're getting to the answer to the problem. The problem is kind of like this area of investigation more than it is something that's wrong. Another image, you know, some of these images have reasons for being in here. This one doesn't. It moves me inside for some reason, and I hope maybe it moves you. Something about color, something about water, light, something about an opportunity to expand into a larger sense of who I am. So in most chapters, Jung types somebody. So Schiller, he says, belonged to a definite type and was compelled, and this is interesting, even in spite of himself, as am I, so Jung is saying, to give a one-sided presentation. Schiller belongs to the introverted type. So as much as the people talk about Jung transcending type, he's admitting even he is making a one-sided type presentation, as am I. Schiller, Jung, and myself all share a similar type profile. But hopefully these images evoke something in you. So you feel something on the inside. And that it may not represent something clear. Jung talks a lot about the symbol. And maybe this is a symbol. It's a symbol of some kind of path forward. And maybe for us as individuals, maybe for us as the type community. But it just leaves it open to kind of wondering. Back to typing, he as an introvert, and this is Schiller, had a better relationship to ideas than to things. So this is for Jung, some of what introversion, extroversion is. Relation to ideas is introversion, relation to things is extroversion. And then he says the relationship to ideas can be more emotional or more reflective according to whether the individual belongs to the more to the feeling or the thinking type. Which is interesting. Like we're always saying, oh, feeling isn't about emotions, but he's tying them in. In some ways they are. And reflective, he's tying to thinking. I reflect, I think, thinking and feeling, but it's interesting to see his language. This image speaks to me of introversion. Although it's interesting, you know, I think an introvert goes to a place like this to extrovert, to get out into the world in a way that's non-threatening. by these two types, the introvert and extrovert, I distinguish two general classes of men. So he's classifying, let's be fair, which can further be subdivided into the four function types, T, F, S, and N. Feeling as well as thinking can come under the supremacy of the idea, just as both can be dominated by the object. So again, idea object, a different way of looking at introversion and extroversion. Another image, another Oregon image, and one that's so it chokes me up a little bit. This is a hike I went on with my father soon after my mom had passed away, and my father has passed away at this point as well. But it has the same path forward that some of these images have. It kind of emerged. I picked some of my favorite photos, and I realized like there's this curiosity about this mysterious piece of moving forward and of being moved on the inside. And certainly type has helped me come to a sense of my path in the world, and I think is really helpful. This too, this is Eagle Creek, different year, different forest fire, has burnt up. I haven't been back here. I haven't been back to that other river, that was the Brightonbush River. So it's part of why it matters to me. And so this is interesting. This is from that chapter 11, the definitions piece, that he defines the term idea, and he says it's to express the meaning of a primordial image. In the sense, Plato sees the idea as a prototype of things, while Kant defines it as the archetype of all practical employment of reason. I kind of am illustrating just how deep Jung goes with these things. Like, what does he mean by idea? He means the Platonic ideal of ideas. Literally, he's going back that far. So there's great depth to read Jung, and I encourage you to go into it, just to explore kind of where he was going. This image I said speaks to my soul. I guess I resonate with that bird and maybe the path that bird is on, and what those mountains might mean. What about yourselves? Like, do you want to soar free like this bird in this image? Then he goes on to the next question of subdividing, and he says the question is hard to answer, which is nice to know that Jung also struggles with typing people. And this is interesting. He says, without a doubt, intuition plays a great role with him as a poet. We might reckon him as an intuitive. But in the Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man, it's the title of the book, it is unquestionably Schiller the thinker who confronts us, the introverted thinking type, which Jung identified. But it's interesting, there's a piece in here that we see that there are different parts of us. There's a poet part of Schiller, and there's a thinker part of Schiller. And kind of later on, he says, well, the poet has overtaken Schiller, the thinker. Not a few pages on, the thinker gets the upper hand. What was divided would be united by the vision, enjoyment, and creation of the beautiful to restore the primal unity of human nature. And so we're kind of getting at different notions of what the problem is that we're dealing with, right? It's not just the problem of trying to figure out what types people fit into, but it's something about this two parts of ourselves or multiple parts of ourselves that are struggling with each other. Not only do we have Oregon burning, we have ice storms. This is from this year. So he says, he asks the reader to remember that his hypothesis, that it underlies his whole argument, that there actually is a large class of men for whom the problem of the separated functions is exactly as it is for Schiller. So in some sense, this is the problem of the separated functions. And he's going to take a historical look culturally and for people as well. But for NT is for the introverted thinking type, how do you get out of your head and get to this? This is the Japanese gardens in Portland. How do you get to experiencing your life in the moment and beauty? I think it goes on that his argument follows Schiller's, that it's less concerned with introversion and extroversion, which is what chapter 1 was about, and more with the typical conflict of the introverted thinking type. So a little bit of shift in problem there. Now it's that there's a typical conflict for each of the types. I recommend you go to the Japanese gardens in Portland if you can make it. It's a beautiful place. It's interesting, these little nails in here have cleared a spot for each through the moss. I guess it's the ions from the metal that do that. So he gets into the cause of this separation of functions, and he says the differentiation of the individual is the motive, and that it was culture, this is now Schiller, it was culture itself that inflicted this wound upon modern humanity. And Jung goes on, this one sentence shows Schiller's wide grasp of the problem, the breakdown, this is his italics, the breakdown of the harmonious cooperation of psychic forces in instinctive life. This idea that before society and culture, we ran around, we were integrated, we weren't differentiated, and that this veritable amfortis wound, this is kind of the Grail legend, this wound that wouldn't heal, because the differentiation of our one function among several inevitably leads to the hypertrophy of one and the neglected atrophy of the others. Okay. There's a lot of symbolism for this in this picture for me. My last name is Poole. Resonate a lot with water imagery. This is another, this is a gem of a creek. It's called Opal Creek here in Oregon. It goes through an old growth forest. It's why the water is so pure. It's another drainage that burnt this year. And it's an emotional thing to know that we're destroying our world in some ways. And I think I'm trying to get us towards some way of solving that. So Schiller goes on, so he's saying, so if the community makes the function the measure of the man, if it respects in one of its citizens only memory, another a tabulating intellect, and in a third only mechanical skills. So this is from 1795. You might see some of the functions in those descriptions. Can we then wonder that the remaining aptitudes of the mind become neglected in order to bestow every attention upon the only one which brings honor and profit? So this is an interesting view of our dominant function, that it's cultivated in some ways to meet society's demands. So then Jung kind of goes back to the Greeks, and Schiller is looking back to the Greek as the ideal. And Jung is saying, well, the Greek, his advantage was that he was less differentiated, has an all-round development, but that was only possible because thousands of his fellow men were cramped and crippled by circumstances that were all the more wretched. A high level of individual culture, but a collective culture was quite unknown. So this idea that a few kind of Renaissance men at the top could have this holistic personality that we're looking for only because of the slaves that they had underneath them. And Jung is making the argument then that with Christianity, the chief value of the individual was proclaimed as an imperishable soul, so that it was no longer possible for this Renaissance group, this inferior majority of the people to be suppressed. I'm sorry, inferior majority of people to be suppressed in actual fact for the freedom of a more valuable minority. And his argument is kind of that we've shifted from the Greek model to something kind of inside ourselves, that we've enslaved our seven functions to have one at the top. I noticed that this idea that Christianity got us away from slavery so that this little group at the top could be a Renaissance men doesn't fit with Thomas Jefferson, who was in that role. But again, he's a slave owner and he doesn't know how to get past the solution. With technology, we actually have machines that do a lot of that work. Like maybe we don't have to do that. So to continue on with the argument, so one-sidedness inevitably leads the individual into error, but the race to truth, says Schiller, and Jung mirrors that. The privileged position of the superior function is as detrimental to the individual as it is valuable to the society. And Richard, we can go ahead and launch that poll right now, which is a poll about our superior function. So if people can kind of, I'm gonna do it, participate as well. I mean, it kind of puts it in a different frame right now, right? We very much identify with our. This is actually a Greek festival, so this is a little piece about culture. This is similar. This is the Polish festival, and I think there's something endearing about younger folks today embracing culture and having individuality. Why don't we go ahead and if we're ready, Richard, we can go ahead and see the results of the poll. All right, so NI, no SI, a lot of extrovert intuitives, great. And don't know, nobody that doesn't know and nobody that doesn't know what it is. So that's pretty cool. and people are tracking along with what I'm saying here. So he's saying that Schiller overlooked the Christian solution, that his spiritual eye was more focused on beauty and antiquity than on the Christian doctrine of redemption, which nevertheless had no other aim than what Schiller was strove for, the deliverance from evil. So he's shifting the problem a little bit, right? He's moving the goals. Now we have to solve the entire problem of evil rather than just classifying people. But this one-sided development must inevitably lead to a reaction, since the suppressed inferior functions cannot indefinitely be excluded from participating in life and development, that the underdeveloped may be granted an opportunity to live. So, I mean, there's this idea that we suppress certain functions. In the Victorian age, certainly repressed sexuality. But that Jung's idea of the unconscious is that that's not a sustainable solution, that something comes up. And I do love in this photo, just a little bit that the ice is breaking. Do you guys see the laser on there? Yeah. That the ice is starting to break, that there's a little crack in some of the ice and that it is melting. And the idea that there's something underneath us that's waiting to burst forth. And he's suggesting here that beneath the neglected functions, there lie hidden far higher individual values of the greatest value for individual life that can endow the life of the individual with an intensity and beauty that he will vainly seek in his collective function. That there's a satisfaction and a joie de vivre, which the development of his individual values alone can give. So dominant function is great, but he's calling it the collective function. This is how we've earned our place in society. And I thought this photo was a great one for the joie de vivre. This is not someone with INTJ preferences, and she's clearly getting some joie de vivre in her life. There's another line here we'll see later that's called the hero line. We'll take a look at that in a little bit. I love this quote from Schiller. In what relation should we stand to past and future ages if the cultivation of human nature made such a sacrifice necessary? We should have been the bond slaves of humanity and branded upon our mutilated nature the shameful traces of this servitude, in order that a later generation might devote itself in blissful indolence to the care of its moral health and develop the free growth of its humanity. And I'm suggesting like we have this opportunity, like we are that future generation. The past generations literally were enslaved to provide us with this opportunity to get out, to experience beauty, to experience feeling, to maybe not take the straight and narrow path, I guess is maybe the analogy, but this weird winding path that kind of heads off through the woods, to go off and explore. And not just what our type preferences suggest, but what the other ones suggest. And he goes back into history that the Christian doctrine offered wasn't actually a solution, but a breaking free, a detachment of that one function from all the others, which made an equally peremptory claim to government. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Several years ago, this drainage has burnt as well. I've not been back. I don't know if that's still there. But that crude antagonism within him must have ceased before we may dare to promote his diversity, before we can submit the multiplicity in him to the unity of the ideal. And I think this is where traditional type is really playing a role, is and somehow getting this multiplicity antagonism within us into some order. If we're going to go on to individuation, we need to understand, like, oh, introverted thinking is that thing I'm doing all the time. Extroverted feeling or an introverted feeling are places to explore, but to not just abandon our strengths, but to unify first and move forward. And there are spiritual pathways to go in there. I think type is great. Art is great. Thus, it is not to be a detachment or redemption of the inferior function, but an acknowledgement of it, a coming to terms with it that unites the opposites on a path of nature. So again, not the repression or elevation of the inferior, but some kind of path in nature that can unite the two. And I thought this image was a great, this is the middle fork of the salmon in Idaho. Yeah, that it's beautiful because that smoke is coloring the sun. And this other year, our world is burning is part of the message here. So Jung goes back to the revolution in France, as far as Schiller, that the contemporary revolution in France, begun in the name of philosophy and reason, it ended in blood-drenched chaos. The goddess of reason proved herself powerless. And this is a key issue. He's writing about INTPs here. He's writing about rationality and this idea that we're going to checkmate our problems and solve everything through the Enlightenment and the guillotine and the terror, because people weren't taking a larger view. He goes on to say that rooted not merely in the spirit of that age, but that it was in Schiller's subjective psychology that he sought the root of evil in the wrong place, ascribing such efficacy to reason out of a superstitious overvaluation of truth, that barbarism consists in one-sidedness, lack of moderation, and bad measure in general. So even as a rational, right, temperament grouping, it's not that rationality is wrong, but that we've, as a Western society, we've put too much reliance on it. I mentioned I haven't taken all of the photos because I'm in some of them. That's me in both of these photos. I mentioned the hero line. This is the hero line that I'm taking here. This is the joie de vivre line. Now I understand over here. But there's a rush of an exhilaration. Talked to someone who knew type, and he told me, but David, extroverted sensing isn't even in your car. It's not in the top half of your stack. And I was kind of like, well, I wish he told me that before I went and ran with Big Brother, because that was kind of terrifying. But in some ways, I wish I did. I'm glad that I didn't know. Like maybe I'd have been like, oh, I shouldn't take up kayaking. I'm not the kayaking type. But this is bad measure in general. This line here that I'm doing, I was lucky to survive. Like I was overvaluing experience, extroverted sensing, and was making bad choices that day. And I got lucky. So we need some balance and not just a diving in. This is kind of what he's saying about Nietzsche later in the Dionysian approach. But for the beginning of the 19th century, from the French Revolution onward, the enthronement of the goddess of reason in Notre Dame, which I guess they did right around that time, they put a statue of the goddess of reason in Notre Dame, a symbolic gesture of great significance to the Western world, rather like the hewing down of Woden's oak, or Odin's oak, by the Christian missionaries. And this is paganism that they overthrew. For then, as at the Revolution, no avenging bolt from heaven struck the blasphemer down. I was really called. I was called to mind this year. Notre Dame is burning as well. So even there, the goddess of reason, that we're all going to be enlightened, and that's going to solve all our problems. Science and rationality hasn't borne out. Then he goes on to Rousseau. We're 20 paragraphs into the chapter by this point. And Rousseau was saying that the citizen perhaps is just the numerator of a faction whose value depends on the denominator. His value depends on the whole, that is, on the community. Good social institutions are those best fitted to make a man unnatural, to exchange his independence for dependence, to merge the unit into the group. And there's a thread that kind of leads through Rousseau towards socialism and communism that didn't end up that well with Stalin killing tens of millions of his citizens, and Chairman Mao doing something. Not that there's not value to socialism, but blinded adherence to, I would say, extroverted feeling also causes problems. That kind of group image there. That's the same day that we had the eclipse. And a certain sense of camaraderie. I didn't know most of these people, but we felt together during that day. So he goes on to say, well, Rousseau is deceived. What Rousseau describes is nothing but that primitive collective mentality which Lévi-Brühl has aptly termed participation mystique, this suppression of individuality is nothing new. One naturally projects it into the institutions of the church and the state, but the suppressive power lies unconsciously in ourselves. It's a pretty interesting piece. That both culturally and personally, we're suppressing parts of ourselves. And Jung, cops to this idea that he's making a one-sided presentation. He's very individually oriented, as am I, and some of that just seeps through. This is a couple of blocks from my house, actually. I put it in here just as this idea of balancing out beauty and, in this case, capitalism, the Wendy's, but that they take the time at Wendy's to install this flower bed is hopeful and a part of a solution, I think. Let's see. So the knowledge of the conflict between the types, he's shifted the problem again. Now it's between people, and the typical mechanism compels us to look around for something that would establish their harmony. Yeah, but we're at a juncture in time. Maybe you're at a juncture in your life, and there's different ways of going over problems, going under problems. You've got an introverted thinker, an introverted sensor, introverted intuitive, and an extroverted intuitive, all somehow getting through this as a group. So what is the cooperative solution that we need to find as a species to get ourselves to move forward? And then he highlights that the various types will see these facts in a different light, and that the problem is different. That the types see their problems different, and there are different problems to be taken on. But one of those answers is beauty. He doesn't accept it as the final answer. It doesn't solve evil in the world, for example. But for many of us intuitives that get caught in our heads, getting out to a park to see, gosh, this beautiful reflections, the way it tracks towards these ducks that are in there, what this mysterious area is in the background. Hopefully you feel some sense of being moved by beauty and mystery here. It certainly does for me. So beauty is this one solution. Beauty was to be the mediator, which should restore the primal unity of human nature. On the contrary, all experience goes to show that beauty needs her opposite as a condition of her existence. I think the Wendy's photo was part of that. This is a beautiful photo as well. You can see Coca-Cola's in there. I kind of like that this little shop city state is in there because we were talking about that. But beauty and aesthetic beauty in and of itself didn't fully answer the question. We need all parts of ourselves, and some of that is the ugly parts. So he's saying that no attempt at mediation will be successful if it does not understand how to release the energies of the inferior functions and lead them towards differentiation. And it's an energetic model in Jung's view, and there's something to be said for what is that energy? What is waiting to still be exploded in all of us? I find these fireworks I like actually better in photographs than when I was there watching them, as they capture something about this pent-up energy and this possibility for the future to be beautiful. So similarly, the transcendental way, which Schiller sets out to tread, must not be understood as a piece of critical ratiocination based on knowledge, but symbolically as the way a man always follows when he encounters an obstacle that cannot be overcome by reason. I'm kind of presenting this to you. Maybe everyone's hoping like, oh, he's going to provide that rational solution. It's this transcendent function that we actually have to come up with some way. Maybe you're up in a river and it's gorged in, and really the only way out is through this waterfall. Getting in your head and thinking about it isn't the solution. Like somehow extroverted sensing is a good function to develop. And I love that this talk highlights both of these pieces for me. You would say that extroverted sensing and introverted feeling are 7th and 8th in my function stack. But you can get out and you can experience movement, you can experience beauty. And I fear that at times type may restrict us and say, I'm not that type. So what overvaluation of the intellect? What rationalism? Too prone to overestimate the importance and efficacy of reason. And Jung is struggling at this point to solve humanity's descent into World War I, right? He's writing psychological types right after the enlightened age and Western rationality have gone to gas masks and machine guns, trench warfare. And I do love this image of these two girls, these little kids, because in some ways that's the value. How are we going to save our society, our culture? This is 1914, 15, 16. This is maybe a decade after man finally achieved human flight, the Renaissance dream of flying. And, they're already flying over to London and dropping bombs on them. A quarter century later, the Blitz would drop 60,000 bombs on London in a single night. So we're still struggling with these issues. How does that work? So he suggests that we first must have lingered a long time with the opposites, and from the energy that's lost to them is built that third thing, which is the beginning of a new way. So, while the West plays chess, which is a very kind of rational, logical piece, the East plays Go, which is a very different game of playing stones and developing influence for the future. It's more of a right-brained, intuitional approach than a logical kind of dismembering of your opponent. And so some of it is finding holistic answers. Instead of laying blame or demanding solutions, how are we going to lay stones to honor future generations? So go back for every introvert, his God is his highest value is the abstraction and conservation of the ego, kind of being inside the head. For the extrovert, on the contrary, the God is the experience of the object, complete immersion in reality. Now it goes on, these views are valid only for the conscious psychology of the types. In the unconscious, the relations are reversed. Which kind of made me think, like, thanks, Carl, as if this wasn't complicated enough. Half of us have our type preferences, half of us are upside down, like this little bird. But how does that reversal come about? This is the whole point. Somewhere or other, man must be related, must be subject to something. But that would be to concede to the archaic inferior function an unlimited right to existence, which Nietzsche, at least in theory, actually did. And this is that Apollonian and Dionysian of being an INTP and just going out and embracing the Dionysian, this celebration of life and wine and women and song. And Nietzsche ended up insane for the last decade of his life and being caretaken by his mother and his wife. And it didn't really pan out for him. Nietzsche's idea of the Superman kind of led Germany into a similar terrible couple of decades. And at some point, Jung suggests that Siegfried, the German hero, has to be killed. He has this dream of him killing Siegfried because this heroic effort to go out and redeem ourselves in some ways our own problem. But there's still this question of good and evil. This is my version of the fruit. This is a persimmon. This temptation to want to grab life as a fruit and bite into it and have juice just running down your face. Like, how do we come to terms with that tug and pull? And talks about this idea of enantiodromia from Heraclitus that ensures that time will come when this deus obscunditus, this underground God, shall rise to the surface and press the God of our ideals to the wall. It is as though the men at the close of the 18th century had not really seen what was taking place in Paris, but lingered on in an aesthetic, enthusiastic, or trifling attitude in order to delude themselves about the real meaning of that glimpse into the abysses of human nature. And this was the World War I of that period. Was these ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity. It sounded good and rational, and ended up in what they called the terror. Like I said, Stalin purged millions of his brothers and comrades. This Deus absconditus it's a real problem for all of us. It goes on, when Schiller lived, the time for dealing with that netherworld had not yet come. Nietzsche at heart was much nearer to it. An epic of unprecedented struggle that I think we're still in. The only true pupil of Schopenhauer, who tore through the veil of naivete and in his Zarathustra conjured up from the nether region ideas that were destined to be the most vital content of the coming age. And it strikes me that this Deus absconditus is alive and well in 2021. There's 70 million of my countrymen who voted for something, and they may not be rational. I think we tell people, "Oh, you're not rational," but there's still a revolution and a world where there's something going on that I think type and an understanding of psyche is crucial towards. The age is enlightened. Why is it that we still remain barbarians? So what is the path forward? This drainage has not burned. How do we save something for the next generation? It's a different book, but it's about individuation. You know, how conscious and unconscious do not make a whole when one of them is suppressed and injured by the other. Both are aspects of life. It is the old game of hammer and anvil. Between them, the patient iron is forged into an indestructible whole, an individual. So some of this is just engaging. It's not the rational solution. It's getting out there and being part of it. And that there's, this is kind of a Zen version of wholeness. The moon is a symbol for our wholeness. How the harmonizing of conscious and unconscious data is to be undertaken cannot be indicated in the form of a recipe. I've got no recipe for you today. It is an irrational life process which expresses itself in a definite symbol. Which is interesting. So it's not actually the symbol. A lot of people are like, oh, the transcendent function gives you the symbol, and there it is. Something is getting expressed by the symbol, and that's what we need to grow into. I love this photo too. These are the Tetons. I love the idea that when I kind of look at the near grass and transit across the Tetons, that I reconnect with this far grass, and that I know at the same time this is a beaver dam, and so I try to picture it from all of those different perspectives. And maybe that's how we need to look at ourselves, right? Out of this union emerge new situations and new conscious attitudes. I therefore called the union of opposites the transcendent function. This rounding out of the personality into a whole may well be the goal of any psychotherapy that claims to be more than a mere cure of symptoms. And I think part of my highlighting our challenges is also to challenge us to be imaginative and embrace beauty and look forward to what we might create given what we've got here, what we've discovered, and what might be. Again, this theme of this path forward, you know, what might that entail? In his deepest essence, he must be a being who partakes in both instincts. And this is really important, yet may also differentiate himself from them in such a way that though he may suffer from them, and in some cases submit to them, he can also use them. So this is kind of our type development, right? Not just that I am introverted thinking, but that I'm able to shift around from time to time. But first, he must differentiate himself from them as from natural forces to which he is subject, but which he does not declare himself identical. And I think this is a key piece of this transcendent function is, we have all our functions, but how do we rise above it and make choice? Kind of Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl has this idea that you have some choice. When someone says something, you get to react and separate yourself from your habitual attitudes and your responses. And I think it's crucial for humanity now. I love this photo, and it's funny, you know, originally I think I tended to look at this little guy and think, boy, there's the individual. And I've come around to the idea that no, they're all individuals. don't know if anyone's seen the movie Harold and Maude, but she makes the same point. Every single one of those tulips is an individual tulip. But he gets back to this, that Schiller has put his finger on something very important, namely the possibility of separating out an individual nucleus, which can be at one time the subject and at another time the object of the opposing functions, though always remaining distinguishable from them. Right? This is a pretty hopeful thing. Like, we're not compelled by our history and our functions. We can all aim to be individuals. And this is interesting, that this separation, this transcendence, is as much an intellectual as a moral judgment, in that it, in one case, comes about through thinking and another through feeling, which is pretty interesting. We tied feeling to emotion earlier, but he's also tying it to moral judgment here, which I think is pretty important. But that in either of those, we can either reason our way through how we're separate from our functions, or we can realize morally, maybe like Frankl did, there's a reason for us to be able to exercise choice. And our world is asking this from us. This is Larch Mountain. This is a place that hasn't burned. This is where that mushroom is growing. And there's still time. There's still hope. But if the separation is unsuccessful, a dissolution of the individuality into pairs of opposites inevitably follows, since it becomes identical with them. A further consequence is disunion within oneself, or an arbitrary decision in favor of one or the other side, together with a violent suppression of its opposite. This is a real danger, right? This is actually one of my photos that I did win a prize for. It's a Valentine's Day piece. But maybe it calls to you. Maybe the translucent, the color, this little bit of water. Maybe this presentation is calling to you. Thus, when the individual consistently takes his stand on one side, the unconscious ranges itself on the other and rebels. If the individuality fails to differentiate itself from the opposites, it becomes identical with them and is inwardly torn asunder. This is the danger for us, our culture or ourselves, so that a state of agonizing disunion arises, but deliverance is one from differentiation. I think that's the lesson for me, certainly, and for us as a society. We're getting close to the end here. But again, some kind of pathway forward, some kind of path, and beauty is an important part of it. Then Jung talks, a key part of his life, that this, when he was stuck after he broke with Freud, this idea that this small boy is still around and possesses a creative life, which I lack. This moment was a turning point in my fate, but I gave in only after endless resistances. For it was a humiliating experience to realize that there was nothing to be done except play childish games. I began accumulating suitable stones, and I started building cottages, a castle, a whole village. And this is the other half of this solution that Schiller came up with, is what he calls the play instinct. And it's come up in presentations to this week. This idea of not taking ourselves so seriously, even though it's kind of a heavy presentation. Sometimes we need to laugh, we need to get out and enjoy. Aesthetics, extroverted sensing. Jung accepts this solution. He doesn't accept it for everybody, but he accepts it partially. And so maybe beauty is a part of this. Maybe we are these flowers. Very close to the end here. So the nearer we approach to the middle of life, and the better we have succeeded in entrenching ourselves in our personal standpoints and social positions, the more it appears as if we had discovered the right course and the right ideals and principles of behavior. For this reason, we suppose them to be eternally valid and make a virtue out of unchangeably clinging to them. We wholly overlook the essential fact that the achievements which society awards are won at the cost of a diminution of personality. Many, far too many, aspects of life which should also have been experienced lie in the lumber room among dusty memories. And sometimes even they are glowing coals under gray ashes, right? Something that can be rekindled, right? Something we can blow on and revive and get a joie de vivre. And I love this photo too. We've seen this picture, but it's just this little group of us talking. I looked up, I was like, boy, life is beautiful. And just shifted over here and took this amazing photo. how do we do that? In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the experts, there are a few. He's suggesting that we want to get back to the beginner's mind and not necessarily be the experts. But there's a path forward. We're back to the Japanese gardens here in Portland. That there's a joie de vivre. There's a psyche to be developed, and that our categories may not be the entirety of who we are. And just an emphasis that some of this is about the next generation and their pathway forward in a lush green place. So I have a little bit of time. So the closing points, maybe, I think I have 5 or 6. Maybe there's more to type, and simply identifying best fit. Maybe not knowing everything, of re-embracing beginner's mind, letting loose somewhat of our type expertise. And I think that narrative of knowing who everybody is not served the type community well. And I think that this uniqueness and individuality is something to emphasize. And maybe we have an opportunity, maybe for the first time in history, to really understand the psyche and embracing it consciously, making a wider future possible for us and future generations who have literally slaved away for us to be where we're at today. And I'll get that out of the way. Maybe life is beyond what makes sense, what's logical and rational and is understood. It doesn't require us to overthrow logic, just allows us to celebrate. And that being moved by beauty and overcoming obstacles, using imagination, setting aside our dominant functions, these all open the possibilities to becoming childlike again, like Christ talked about. And at the beginner's mind may be an important part of that. And that this applies as much to us as individuals as it does to our culture and our history of type. That what could we become, do you suppose, if we let go of defending our positions and explored with an open mind and an open heart, what creativity and imagination, joie de vivre, what fireworks lay inside of us. And then finally, I just wanted to thank you and to thank BAPT. Thank everyone who's worked in this field for the last 100 years to figure this all out. And thank God we still have some time. The burning and the insurrections, the killings, these are going on, but we have the opportunity now to change the human condition. And this is part of the evolution that brought us to where we're at. So thank you. I think I'm pretty close to the end, but I'd love to hear any comments or certainly questions.
Thank you very much, David. Just to say, if we want to have some questions, that's great. If anyone wants to maybe put in the chat whether they've got a question to put forward. Do you want to keep recording this bit, David, or do you want to stop the recording?
No, I'd prefer not to, actually.
So to not record?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll end it now. Thank you. Okay.